Let's go on to some other issues today. And I mentioned at the top of the program that former Prime Minister Tony Abbott is in Taiwan. He's there at a particularly fascinating and fraught time. China won't like it. But as Abbott explained at the start of his speech, China's belligerence is one of the reasons he chose to attend.
2 years back, I hesitated to attend this conference lest that provoke China. But since then, as you know, Beijing has torn up the One Country, Two Systems Treaty on Hong Kong. It's put upwards of 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps. It's boosted cyber spying on its own citizens, cancelled popular personalities in favour of a cult of the Red Emperor, brutalised Indian soldiers in the Himalayas, coerced other claimants in its eastern seas, and flown ever more intimidatory sorties against Taiwan.
Yeah, Chinese fighter jets continue to intimidate Taiwan, trespassing into its airspace. But while Taiwan's fears of invasion are palpable, Abbott stressed that Australia too is dealing with bullying tactics from Beijing.
It's weaponised trade, especially against Australia, with our barley, wine and coal exports all stopped on spurious grounds. And its embassy has published 14 demands, essentially that we become a tributary state that no self-respecting country could accept. The trigger for all this was politely seeking an impartial inquiry into the origins of the Wuhan virus.
Yeah, the Chinese leadership in Beijing, of course, will have been watching and listening to all of this with interest. Let me now bring in Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Peter, I wonder if you can tell us first up what Beijing will make of that speech and whether we should expect a reaction.
Oh, I'm sure we'll get a reaction, Chris, and it will be the usual type, accusing Australia of having a Cold War mentality. Tony Abbott's quite right to say that the way that China has behaved internationally over the last few years is almost exhausting its ability to shock anymore with the type of language that it will use. I thought it was an absolutely first-rate thing that he went to Taipei to give that speech and that Malcolm Turnbull did so a year earlier to the same forum. I'm looking forward to maybe Kevin Rudd going so we can get some bipartisanship here in terms of Australia's support for Taiwan.
Yeah, Malcolm Turnbull pointed out on ABC Radio this morning that he'd been there a couple of years ago, so he didn't criticise Tony Abbott. So, well, that's peace breaking out in Australia when Malcolm Turnbull doesn't criticise Tony Abbott. Scott Morrison has stressed that Tony Abbott is there as a private citizen, but of course he's a former Prime Minister, but he also has a role as an envoy for the government in India. So he has a semi-official capacity, so that'll add weight to the visit, won't it?
I think this is significant. And, you know, the context here, Chris, is that we have in Australia overly stringently applied the one China policy to say that there can be almost no contact with Taiwan. You know, as a career defence official, I had to leave the Defence Department before it was possible for me to go to Taiwan to actually speak with Taiwanese folk. And the absurdity is we could find ourselves in a military coalition helping to defend that country when we can't even talk to their military. I think Australia now needs to rethink how we engage with Taiwan. And Tony Abbott is quite right. It is a very respectable democracy, a liberal democracy, a country which is an important trading partner of Australia. If people are not going to be interested in the defence of Taiwan, why on earth should we ask other countries to be interested in our defence, Chris? What we can do to strengthen our relations with Taiwan, I think, is now an urgent requirement for our government to be thinking about. And Abbott's visit, I think, is a really important step in that, the right step in that direction.
Well, that brings me to what I think might have been the most important part of Tony Abbott's speech, and that was where he very overtly said that the US, confirming, of course, what the US has said, that they would defend Taiwan, but also essentially saying Australia would do the same. Have a look.
The State Department has just affirmed that the US commitment to Taiwan is rock solid. I don't believe America could stand by and watch China swallowed up. I don't believe Australia should be indifferent to the fate of a fellow democracy of almost 25 million people.
You meant to say Taiwan being swallowed up, of course, but that's a very strong statement. The Taiwanese were very pleased about that, but there'll be plenty of critics, including in Beijing.
Tony Abbott is absolutely right, though. We can't be indifferent to the fate of a democracy the size of 24 million people in our part of the world. I think what's happening here, Chris, is that up until now, the US and other countries have deliberately preserved a policy of ambiguity about the defence of Taiwan. They've never been prepared to explicitly say how they would react to Chinese aggression against that country. Because Beijing is becoming so much more aggressive now, I think that needs to be rethought. And I think what we are starting to see is the requirement, particularly from the United States, to be more explicit in saying, yes, we will defend Taiwan, we will not tolerate Chinese aggression of that nature. And of course, if that's the path the US goes down, Australia shouldn't be surprised that we will probably be the second country after Japan to get that phone call from Joe Biden saying, what are you going to do? We're at a point now where the best thing we can do to preserve peace in the region is to make it clear to China that we will not tolerate unilateral and military aggression from them directed towards Taiwan. This, in other words, is going to stop the region from going to war.
Indeed.
If we continue to refuse to talk about it, the risks of conflict, I think, will grow.
Indeed. We're getting much more overt language from the US, from Australia and other countries because of China's belligerence. Thanks for joining us, Peter. I appreciate it.